Hello everybody, thank you for staying. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Scrum abandonment in small teams. This is work with Peter Sporten, whose name I can't pronounce correctly, who was a master's student at Lancaster University and now works at Bloomberg. This is kind of what he did for his dissertation, and I thought it was pretty good, so we sent it here. So the research question here was, what factors are associated with abandoning Scrum in distributed teams? To explain this, first I'm going to talk a little bit about what distributed Scrum is. I will assume that at least one person in the room isn't familiar with this. In Scrum is a project management framework. Scrum divides the project manager role into two different roles. So there's the product owner role, and the product owner is responsible for making sure the project does the right stuff. So making sure we're building the right system. The product owner is kind of like a chief requirements analyst. They're in charge of liaising with the client, and they act as a boundary spanner between the team and the client. The Scrum Master is responsible for running the process. The Scrum Master records what everybody's doing and that kind of thing, and is often one of the developers, but not always. So that leaves the team. The team is the development team. Scrum does not distinguish between analysts, testers, programmers, etc. They're all just the team. Distributed Scrum is when the team is spread across more than one site. A distributed Scrum team could have developers at different sites, or all the developers could be at one site and the management could be at a different site, or it's really any situation that involves multiple sites and distributed work. In Scrum, there's a product backlog. The product backlog contains everything that you want to build about the software. It usually is composed of user stories, but in practice, it's user stories and bug fixes and to-do items and all kinds of stuff just piled in a big, often big physical pile of cards. During a sprint, at the beginning of a sprint, the product owner selects from the product backlog a number of stories that they want developed during the sprint, and that becomes the sprint backlog. And the developers decide who's doing what. They just kind of, by consensus among themselves, decide who is going to develop each story. Then the stories are put in a kind of matrix structure on a board called the Scrum Wall of Product Back or Sprint Backlog that shows who's doing what and what's done and what hasn't been done yet. And that stays up on a wall near the development team for the rest of the sprint. A couple of rules here. The product owner is not allowed to change what is being done in the sprint during the sprint. Now, sprints are only 30 days long, usually. They can be 2 weeks or maybe up to 6 weeks or 2 months in a really big project, but somewhere around 30 days long. And within that 30 days, we freeze our assumptions about the world in order to proceed. So the product owner is not allowed to mess with things during the sprint. Now, during the sprint, the team builds the increment. The increment is the set of changes to the software, and at the end of the sprint, they roll it out in some way. Scrum is named for a daily stand-up meeting that is held by the team. The daily Scrum is a 15-minute meeting where everybody stands up, and it is intended for people to share what they're doing right now. It's supposed to be very quick and punchy. People just say, this is what I did yesterday, this is what I'm doing now, and here are any things that are in my way or any problems that I have right now that I need solved before I can proceed. And this is the primary mechanism for coordination in Scrum. So we don't have a lot of coordinating documents, and you don't have a lot of sort of project manager intervention to coordinate the team. The primary coordination mechanism is the 15-minute daily meeting. Scrum is extremely popular. It is probably the most popular project management framework going. In surveys that I've done, it is the far and away winner. In surveys by Scott Ambler, Scrum is always the most popular method. Nothing else comes anywhere close. Strangely, if you read surveys by Gartner, who never explain what their survey methodology is, Scrum isn't so popular. I don't get that. I don't know who they're surveying, but I have a feeling that that reflects some bias in their sampling. Of course, we don't know because they don't publish their methodology. Scrum was originally intended for co-located development. So it was never meant for distributed development, but in years since Scrum became popular, the original proponents have written about how to modify it for distributed teams. A couple of recommendations they've come up with. They want everybody in the daily Scrum, so if you have multiple sites, they all have the daily meeting at the same time, and everybody's in it at once. The sprints should be shorter for distributed Scrum, because there's more to go wrong. Rely more on automated testing. The product backlog should be shared. Everybody's got the same product backlog, but if you have teams in 3 different sites, developers in 3 different sites, it can be useful to have separate sprint backlogs for each team, for each sub-team. Regular travel between sites is important. You know, you want to have people physically go from one site to another and get to know people and have coffee and talk to them and build up a shared mental models as well as repertoire. And perpetual teleconferencing can help. So if you've got a camera in a remote office and a laptop set up somewhere with just a constant feed so that you can just walk over to it and yell for somebody if you need something, that's worked in some cases. The challenges here are, there's sort of 2 main ones. One has got to do with work synchronization across different time zones. So if you have a big time zone differences, having a daily Scrum meeting at the same time can be really problematic. And the other one is sitting during the Scrum meeting, because when we use teleconferencing, we tend to sit. But Scrum is really big on this stand-up meeting thing. We were interested in how things go terribly wrong during Scrum adoptions in distributed teams. So we were interested because the vast majority of the Scrum literature are very positive cases, not positivists, just positive cases, where proponents of Scrum have implemented it somewhere and everything's gone wonderfully. And I've always wondered, maybe everything goes wonderfully because Kent Beck or Ken Schwaber was the project manager. You know, because one of the best project managers currently living happened to be involved with the project. Maybe that was why it worked, and not because they used Scrum or some other project management framework. So I wanted to get into, you know, what goes wrong in normal teams that don't have these hotshots on them. Now, this is really tricky. So to study this kind of thing, you need to find a site that is distributed. You need to find a distributed environment where they have attempted to use Scrum, where it's failed unambiguously, because often you get things that sort of work and sort of don't work and it's hard to tell, but you need unambiguous failure. You need helpful informants who are willing to talk to you and willing to speak honestly about what went terribly wrong, which is hard to get. And it needs to all have happened very recently, because otherwise we're relying on people's sort of flaky memories about something that happened 3 years ago. You need to get it sort of while it's happening. You need to get in there while it's still going wrong. That is an extremely difficult thing to do, and probably why nobody's done it. So when we got this case, we were very excited to get this opportunity, and we thought that it really was a revelatory case in the way that Yin suggests, where it's something that nobody's got their hands on. So we found a firm, which I will refer to as RA. RA has offices in San Mateo, California, and St. Petersburg, Russia. That's an 11-hour time difference, so that's very distributed. Their product is a marketing data analysis platform. It analyzes like branding data. Their management was largely concentrated in California, while development was largely concentrated in Russia. And RA was in the process of transitioning from an ad hoc, amethodical development approach to Scrum. And when we got in there, they were in the middle of that failing. So our data collection, we did some observation in the St. Petersburg office. We interviewed everyone we could get our hands on. We took copies of all the documents that they would share with us. We took photos of the area, the physical workspace. We took photos of their Scrum wall, which I'll explain in a minute. It's a Scrum wall, sprint, burn down chart, all the same thing. And then we analyzed that using open coding, just the same open coding that all qualitative researchers use. And my colleague, Peter, was a big fan of mind mapping. So he used a lot of mind mapping to link what he was seeing in the case to what he'd read in the literature. I would like to show you a mind map, but mind maps get enormous and they don't translate into slides very well. So you can only see little bits of them and it's not very helpful. we found was that there was two major practices, or not too much, two major factors associated with failure in this case. One of them is closely related to the distributed nature of the work, and the other one is not. So the one that's closely related to the distributed nature of the work was practice degradation. So we think about teams as sort of adopting a method wholesale and then abandoning a method wholesale. But that's not what happened here, and I don't think that really happens much. What happens is people read about a method or learn a bit about a method, and then they modify what they're doing to be more like that method, and then it kind of drifts on its own, or they modify it again slowly. So this is a gradual thing. So when I say degradation, I don't mean abandonment, I mean degradation. This comes from, there's some literature on this, that practitioners don't really use methods. We think about method use, but we don't really use methods. It's more that we base our practice on a method or on bits of a method that we like. Anyway, RA initially adopted Scrum roles. They adopted sprints. They had the same kind of iteration that Scrum suggests. They used all the Scrum meetings, and they adopted many of the Scrum artifacts, including the Scrum wall and user stories, that kind of stuff. But the Scrum practices degraded over time. They slowly, gradually, they sort of lost hold, and they were used less and less. You know, and if you drop a meeting there and an artifact here and this and that, sooner or later you're not doing Scrum anymore. You know, sometimes you ask. This is a real problem with survey research in this area. When you ask somebody, what method are you using, and they say, we're using Scrum, and you say, okay, are you doing daily stand-up meetings? No. Do you have a product backlog? No. Do you have a product owner? No. What part of Scrum are you doing? Right? This happens a lot, that people have an emotional affinity with a method or a practice, and so they'll say they identify with it and they say that they do it, but they don't. Anyhow, so the first practice is the daily Scrum, right? The daily Scrum is about developing shared mental models and coordination. But the 11-hour time difference made this very difficult. They couldn't find any convenient time to have the Scrum. And so what happened was, over time, fewer and fewer people would be participating in the Scrum. And when they did manage to have a Scrum meeting, everybody sat down to use Skype. So they didn't have this pressure. The point of standing up, right, is that standing up for long periods makes you uncomfortable. So it produces this motivation to get on with the business and then go back to work. But there was no such motivation, and so the Scrum meetings tended to run over. But because they ran over, people viewed them as more disruptive, and then they didn't want to participate in them. So after a little while, nobody was participating in these Scrum meetings. The Scrum wall. So in distributed Scrum, you end up with two Scrum walls. In regular Scrum, you have literally a physical wall with a bunch of sticky notes or index cards attached to it that indicate what everybody's doing. And the point of that is that anybody can walk by, see the physical wall, and have an instant sense of what everybody in the team is doing, where everything is, what the status of things are, and who's working on what. But in distributed Scrum, not everybody's in the same office, so that doesn't work. So you end up having to have a virtual Scrum wall. And usually you end up with both. There are lots of problems with this. The virtual Scrum wall made the physical Scrum wall seem redundant. The developers couldn't understand why we had two different walls. The virtual Scrum wall made it so that the management had access to this virtual wall, but they never looked at it. Whereas when you're working in a physical office with this big thing on the wall, you have a tendency to look at it just because it's there, right? But when you have to load up a page and put in a password and stuff to look at something, you just never bothered. Worse, the Scrum Master used to put lots of annotations on the Scrum wall, the physical one, that were not visible. They weren't copied into the virtual one, and so they weren't visible to management. And those annotations had to do with things that had gone wrong in the sprint, and they were the reasons for things not being the way you think they should be. And so the management ended up thinking that the Scrum Master was kind of incompetent because he wasn't delivering stuff when he was supposed to, because they couldn't see all this information on this physical wall. So that didn't go very well. And then the third thing was, the product owner is not allowed to change the requirements during the sprint. This is really, really important. But the product owner did keep changing the requirements during the sprint. So then what happens is the sprint either doesn't finish on time, or it doesn't deliver to scope, because things are changing as you go. And things always change upward. Things never get scoped down during a sprint. Things always get scoped up. And so what happened then was a lot of the sprints went over. A lot of the sprints turned out to be 40 days instead of 30 days. And this made upper management perceive the whole Scrum thing as not working very well, and it made them perceive the Scrum Master as not having a good hold on the process, and was not able to deliver on time. And they felt the development team wasn't very good. So, basically, they lost confidence in the Scrum Master. So what we found was that the slow degradation of specific Scrum practices was associated with the failure. It's not that slow degradation causes failure. That's oversimplified. It's just that we found that it wasn't fast. Like the failure wasn't an instant thing in time. It was a thing that happened gradually as the practices slowly devolved and people abandoned one bit, another bit, and then when you looked at it, you weren't doing Scrum anymore. It wasn't that they decided Scrum is stupid, we're not doing this anymore. It was that it just wasn't there anymore after a while. The second thing that happened that doesn't really have much to do with the distribution is the subversion of the Scrum Master. And to put this briefly, the Scrum Master was the new person on the team, and he was the Scrum Champion. The Scrum Champion is the person who's pushing for the adoption of Scrum. And he got in a political fight with the lead developer. And the lead developer didn't like this whole thing, because when you adopt Scrum, there's no more lead developers. There's no more chief testers. There's just the team. Everyone's the same. Everyone has the same title, team member. So the guy who had been the lead developer perceived this as a demotion, and he was very against it. And then the Scrum Master made a few bad calls, and he had been a systems architect before he was a Scrum Master, and he'd made some bad architectural decisions, and he kind of lost the confidence and the trust of the team. Meanwhile, the lead developer was very charismatic, and he held the confidence and the trust of the team. And what happened was the Scrum adoption got mixed up with the Scrum Master. And when the team railed against the Scrum Master, when he went, Scrum had to go too. So these are the two things that we found that were sort of associated with the failure of Scrum adoption in a distributed team. One is the subversion of the Scrum Master, which is not really related to the distributed aspect. And the other is the gradual degradation of the Scrum practices, which is related to the distributed aspect. Basically, the distribution of the team made it much more difficult to maintain the Scrum practices over time. Thank you very much.